Hey everyone, what is happening? So we're moving on from digestion, we're moving on to respiration, and we're going to be looking at the structure and functions involved with breathing today. All right, so what we've got is I may have the greatest video ever right here. This is part of The Karate Kid. You got to check this out in the notes. One of my favorite movies, one of my life-changing movies. And then right here we've got whale lungs. So whale lungs, very, very big. And just in case people are wondering, this is your respiratory system. You can kind of see the highlighted there. We've got our trachea, we've got our lungs, and now we're going to get into it. We're going to first start with just naming the different structures within our respiratory system and as air flows through it. So you can see here we've got our nose to start, and then this leads us into our nasal cavity. And then air can also come in through our mouth. And inside our mouth, this is called our oral cavity. And then air is going to pass through all this, and it goes to this little structure right here, and this is our epiglottis. Now our epiglottis, we're going to get into the functions of these, but this is really important for preventing things getting into our trachea, which we're going to go to next. Things like food. You know, when sometimes when you're eating and you're laughing or whatnot and having a good time, and you're eating and something goes down the wrong tube, it's because your epiglottis didn't prevent it from going down the wrong tube. From our epiglottis, we've got our pharynx, and then we're going to go to our larynx. And this is where our vocal cords are located, and we're going to see some cool stuff about that as well. From our larynx, we get down into our trachea, and if you put your hands just above your breastbone, you can kind of go up to a soft part right underneath your Adam's apple, and you can feel the ridges of these little pieces of cartilage right here, okay? And that goes down into our trachea, and then we go into our bronchi, and this one is our right bronchi, and on the other side is our left bronchi, and then we get into our right lung, and on the other side we have our left lung. And from the bronchi, because the bronchi are a little bit bigger, we get down into our bronchioles, and these are just smaller spaces. It goes from really, really big in the trachea down to bronchi, it's a little smaller, and then it branches off into our bronchioles. And then that brings us to our alveoli. And these are little like sacks of grapes, and they're covered in capillaries, and this is where external respiration takes place. And then finally, our last structure that really, really is important is our diaphragm. And our diaphragm is what's going to cause the air to rush in or the air to rush out. All right, so those are the different structures, and we're going to go through their different functions. So here's the functions of the structures, and what I did was I've just got these printed out so that we're not just, you don't have to write anything down. I would just like you to listen and read through this. So we had our nose and our nasal cavity, and one of the functions of the nasal cavity is to filter the air with its mucus, hair, and cilia, as well as warm and moisten the air. Now this is really important because if we are just honestly always breathing through our mouth, we're going to get particles down in our throat, and we're going to be having to get those particles out. So it's really good to have our breathing through your nose, because it's going to moisten it and warm it up for your lungs, but it also really filters and cleans it. The next structure we go to is our pharynx. This is a combination of where the air and food passes through. So this is kind of like your throat, or just above your throat. And then we've got our epiglottis, and I said this covers the trachea when we swallow. All right, so when we swallow, your Adam's apple goes up, and you can check that out. And what I'd like you to do here is, if you just Google X-ray of drinking water, you'll be able to see a really, really good diagram or video of someone's epiglottis. The next we have is a larynx. Now this is our Adam's apple, and this contains our vocal cords or voice box. And then from our larynx, we go to our trachea. Now this is considered your windpipe as well, and it's held open by rings of cartilage. And it's also lined with cilia and mucosal cells that are going to help trap and filter out particles. The cilia move in a wave-like motion, and they bring debris up to be coughed out. And if anybody wants to check this out, this is a warning. This is a tracheostomy, and so you might want to check that out, but if you're squeamish with blood and whatnot and surgeries, please do not watch that. From our trachea, which is a fairly large tube, we're going to our bronchi, which branch off into two different lungs. Now, I want you to think of our lungs as like an upside down head of broccoli. All right, so the bronchioles continue to branch out as they get smaller and smaller, and the walls get thinner and thinner, and they end in alveoli. And our alveoli are what is where our external gas exchange happens. Now, there are about 300 million alveoli per lung, and so you'll notice that this is a massive amount of surface area, and this is where we exchange O2 and CO2 between the air and our lungs. Okay, so it's important to have a massive amount of surface area so we can get the most oxygen in and the most CO2 out. Okay. Now, some activities that may hurt your ability to obtain oxygen, the number one is smoking and vaping. And those are going to clog up the alveoli and reduce the amount of oxygen and CO2 that you can get in and out. All right. And so you can see that as the air comes in right here, that the alveoli nice and big, and that's where gas exchange, and they're all covered in blood vessels. So each alveolar sac is enclosed in a single layer of squamous epithelial cells. So these are really flat and allow for quick exchange of gases. They're also surrounded by a mesh of capillaries that bring deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. This is our pulmonary arteries, and we're going to get into that when we do circulation. And then oxygenated blood back from the lungs into the heart via the pulmonary veins. Okay, so pulmonary means relating to the lungs. So whenever you hear pulmonary, that means lungs. So, and remember, just a quick one, all arteries always go away from the heart and veins always goes toward the heart, no matter what type of blood they're carrying, oxygenated or unoxygenated. All alveoli are lined with a lipoprotein, so a fat and a protein. Remember, lipo or lipid is fat, and that has a hydrophilic and hydrophobic end that helps reduce the surface tension of water in the lungs. And so remember that water is a byproduct of cellular respiration. Okay, so all these things are really important for alveoli. We've got the surface area, we've got a whole bunch of them. They're all covered in blood vessels, and they've got special cells in them, special substances in them to keep them inflated, right? So another thing that alveoli have are stretch receptors. So this signals when they're full to send a message to the medulla oblongata to start exhaling. And so we're going to be getting more into this. We're just going through the structure and function at the moment. The lungs in general are cone-shaped and contain what we've been talking about so far. There's blood vessels follow the bronchioles and enclose each alveoli. Now the right lung has 3 lobes, a top, a middle, and a bottom. And top, when we talk about anatomy, is superior, and bottom is inferior, okay? And our left lung has only 2 lobes, a superior and inferior. Now what this does is it allows room for your heart, which is located in your cardiac notch, okay? And that's why your left lung is just a little bit smaller. So I want to bring your attention to this picture right here. So you can see that air is inhaled, and it comes in, and it goes into the alveoli, and it's going to go into the blood vessels, and it goes down into the heart. So that's a pulmonary vein. It goes into the heart and it gets pumped around to the body. Okay. Now when CO2 is released, it goes back to the heart. Remember, those are always veins when they're going back to the heart. And then this pulmonary artery brings unoxygenated blood to the lungs. All right. And we're going to be getting more into that with internal and external respiration. So what controls all this? What governs all this? What controls or what governs all of this? Well, our diaphragm is your muscle located at the very bottom of your thoracic cavity or your rib cage. And what it is, it's a thick dome-shaped muscle that when it's contracted, it causes air to rush in. And when it's relaxed, air rushes out. This is called negative and positive pressure. We're going to be getting into this more next lesson, but what I want you to do is check out the first 15 seconds of this video to help get a sense of what we're talking about there, okay? When we're breathing, the amount of CO2 and O2 is monitored in our body by little chemoreceptors in our heart and in our neck, and they signal for our medulla oblongata, which is the control center of all our involuntary processes in our body. It signals for that part of the brain to either exhale or inhale, depending on the amount of gases in our blood. Okay. Now, in between the lungs, there are membranes, and they are called pleural membranes. And one covers the lungs, and the other covers the inside of the rib cage. Now, in between this pleural cavity, we have a liquid in it. And so what this does is it allows the two things to move and slide against each other without having too much friction. And that's really important. Otherwise, our lungs would always get stuck on the inside of our ribs. And you can see that right here. So we've got our partial pleura, and then our visceral pleura on the lung, and then we've got our pleural space right there, okay? And you'll also see that there's a part that's protecting the lungs from the heart as well, okay? And this is a really good video just explaining the pleural membranes. Now, we've also got the ribs. The ribs provide protection for the heart and lungs, as well as support for the lungs. Muscles attach to the ribs to help increase or decrease the volume of the lungs. So if you're breathing really hard, maybe up at altitude, you're going to use your intercostal muscles. Those are in your ribs to really help expand and shrink the size of your thoracic cavity. So just going back to our picture of all the different parts. So you're going to be responsible for knowing the pathway of air and the different parts and their functions. So just review this, and we went through this, and we're going to get more detail as we go along. Have a good rest of the day. Take care.